Hello and welcome to Vantage Point. I'm Marcia Boyles, and as always I am accompanied here by my co-host Kathleen Taylor. Kathleen, I will remind viewers that you are the clinical social worker at the medical center.
Yes.
We have picked a topic today that I think both of us are finding extremely interesting and even profound. It is telling our personal narratives, our personal life stories. I think we also are finding that it's going to be, we hope, quite pertinent to our resident demographic. Now let's start with the common wisdom that suggests to us that as we age, we begin to look backward more than perhaps forward. And in doing so, we're really kind of reliving and telling stories of past events in our lives. So the question I would like to pose to you to start with here is this part of human nature? Do you believe that it is? Is this why we tell stories?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The idea of telling stories actually kind of goes along with human development. You know, people tell stories at different times of their lives for different purposes, actually. So I'll get to the kind of why people are sort of reflecting on their past more as older adults. But in general, these personal narratives are stories that we tell about our lives that help us gain a sense of our identity, who we are, and also the meaning for our lives, what our purpose is, what we're here for. And as you can imagine, you know, as a child, that looks different than as people get older. You have different goals in mind, but basically
And children do tell stories, don't they?
Yeah, that's when we first started talking about this. I just started to go, yeah, I just remember when my kids were little and they would come home from school and they would just tell me, you know, in graphic detail, you know, what happened that day at school and how they felt. And so that was them, you know, trying to figure out what their experiences were, what it meant to them,
what it meant to you,
and what it meant to me, which is, you know, another aspect of storytelling is we all tell stories kind of internally, but the idea of telling stories to another person adds an extra dimension because it has to do with making that connection with another person, number one, but also, you know, the opportunity for validation and affirmation of who you are. You know, that what you have to say makes a difference.
All right. So at different ages, then you're telling stories for different reasons. That's an interesting notion. I would never have thought of that.
Yeah. But all have to do with, you know, the idea of, you know, working to every part of your life is trying to figure out who you are, you know, as clearly as possible, and what the meaning for your life is. And so, I mean, you know, jumping ahead a little bit, but, you know, as people get older, I think that there's this idea that sometimes people go back sort of to the good old days, that they're trying to more escape the life that they have now because it maybe isn't, you know, they don't feel like it's great, or they're missing something and they start to think more about the past. But in actuality, you know, I think I brought up Erik Erikson a bunch of times because I like his psychological or psychosocial stages of development. But what he talks about as people get older is that kind of the last stage is the stage where in your maturity, you know, you want to be able to look back at your life with a feeling that yes, that life was a good life, it was well lived, that yes, I did have purpose, that I did have meaning, and if people don't achieve that goal, then a lot of times they do experience a sense of distress and a sense of despair. So that is actually a really, really important process that people go through when they're reflecting back through their life. It's not like they're stuck in that back part so much as they're taking all of that and bringing it forward into the here and now to be able to really affirm their themselves and their lives and the meaning of it.
We certainly are very much aware here at Greenspring of people telling their stories. With apologies to Julie Andrews, I would say that the halls resound with the sound of stories.
Right. Right.
Yeah, we just hear them constantly.
Yeah.
And often in great detail. I mean, people are clearly reliving a lot of their past.
Right, right. Another interesting part that I was thinking about in terms of stories is that there are really two parts of stories, of our stories. One is the story itself, which is sort of what happened. The other is the narrative voice. So this is our voice telling our story, and talking about how those facts made us feel. You know, what we feel about what happened, what we think about what happened, and that actually is an interesting part because it's sort of the perception of what happened. So sometimes people can have a story that, you know, sort of on paper sounds like an okay life experience, and when you hear them tell it, it's very much not an okay life experience for them, that they feel very negatively about what happened. And kind
or
of,
very positively.
Or conversely,
I mean,
people could have a life experience that maybe on paper sounds like it was very difficult and very hard, and they have found their strength and found their resilience in that experience, and the telling of that story is much more positive.
One of the things that I have certainly noted in teaching my memoir classes here at Greenspring over the years is that men and women tend to tell their stories differently. And when you're talking about a story and how we felt about it, I think the men tend to be more likely to simply be putting the facts out there. And the women tend to talk about their emotional reaction to instances. Now, I don't know whether you're finding that in therapy or not.
Yeah, I think sometimes you have to dig a little bit deeper with men. But I mean, even when people are telling you about how they're reacting and it sounds unemotional, they're still telling you something about how they feel. So, you know, if somebody's talking a lot about all their successes, how well their career went, all of that, then what you're learning about them is that it's important for them to feel like, you know, they made a difference, that they were successful, that was a value that they lived by, and that was part of who they were or are as a person. That's part of their identity. So.
Yes, and that it's a more subtle thing. And you, as a counselor or therapist, would be picking up on that. In the memoir classes, we probably did not.
Yeah.
As much.
Yeah.
It just sounded. You know, it would sound like just one fact after another. And the women just mostly talked about how they felt about an experience.
Interesting the way we do that.
Yes, it is. And I don't know whether it's a brain difference or whether it's a learned difference.
Yeah, hard to,
or both.
Yeah, I think probably both, more than likely. But yeah, so the idea of sharing your personal stories with another person really adds that extra dimension to it too. And certainly in therapy, it adds an extra dimension to it because you're really talking very specifically about the kinds of narratives that people use that may be not helpful to them. That's sort of what I get into a little bit more is when somebody is telling a story about their life and their framing or their interpreting of it is very much talking about how, they didn't feel like they did well, for example. They didn't feel like they were successful. They felt they were a failure, that they had low self-worth, all of those things. So, when we can take their personal story and help them see that they had successes, because sometimes people just can't see that. They have framed their experiences in such a way that their self-perception is very distorted. And so going over those personal experiences with a therapist to be able to help them to see how those experiences were not exactly the way that they perceive them can be really, really helpful.
Is that a large part of therapy?
If I'm using that technique.
Again, in this demographic?
I think that it's part of it for sure. Because again, telling your personal stories is really part of who we are as human beings. I think something I read that I thought was really good was, personal stories tell us, help us deal with the human condition. And so what's the human condition? The human condition is just life. It's all the ups and downs that we experience, all the highs and lows. The good parts, and also, the sicknesses, our mortality, all of that comes into play. And so when we talk about our lives with other people, we sort of have that shared experience then. And we had talked about shared narratives too.
Right.
The idea that culturally, there are shared narratives in the stories that different civilizations have, mythology. I think families have shared stories about sort of, their ancestors or what happened in families that are kind of their own mythology. And then I think we've talked about the idea of when people of a peer group have grown up in a certain age, have grown up during a time when certain things have happened historically, that really resonates and brings people and connects people. Where were you at during 9/11, or other kinds of times in history that really impacted us greatly.
That's one of the primary factors in our memoir classes that somebody will say, "Do you remember ration stamps?" And then everybody will chime in, "Gosh, I remember, collecting papers and fat and things of that sort." So yes, there's a lot of shared, because we all had similar experiences often in certain periods of our time.
Yeah. So when you're doing that, how does that feel?
Oh, I think it brings great camaraderie, a sense of real sharing. Absolutely. Oh, it's a wonderful feeling.
Yeah.
I think that the richness of the memoir writing experience has much to do with the verbal exchanges afterward. Absolutely. Yeah. As much as the writing.
Yeah. And if you're talking about a human experience that resonates with other people, then that sometimes it's good to know that other people have had a similar experience, because that makes you feel, I guess, sort of more okay.
Well, yes, level. And it spurs all kinds of memories that sometimes you don't even know are in your head.
I know.
And I think you and I had talked briefly about the fact that you're a Joseph Campbell fan. And have been for a number of years, and I'm just recently rewatching the Netflix series, The Power of Myth, with Bill Moyers and Joseph Campbell, and he talking about the fact that every culture has stories, that there are myths and stories in all of them, and most all of them have the basis of the stories is there is a hero or heroine who is facing some kind of trial or adversity, and there is a revelation and a transformation of the individual as a result of the experience or overcoming the experience.
Yeah.
That it's the basis of all all cultures throughout history.
Yeah, I think I love that part, and I think he wrote a book called Man as Myth or something like that. But I think it's the idea that we're all heroes and heroines. You know, that every one of us
Exactly.
is facing our own adversities and is trying to overcome these. And so that's the human condition, sort of in a nutshell, right? You know, that we live our life every day. There are things that go wrong. We have to persevere. We have to struggle.
That's about the size of it.
Yep.
Exactly right, and that's right. We can become our own heroes and heroines.
And actually, that's again going back to the idea of the narrative voice, is that you can change that maybe that story of adversity where the person feels like they were not successful and they should have done better. By working through that story with them, you can change that narrative.
Yes.
They can change
Yes.
that narrative to see, yeah, it was hard. Maybe they didn't, achieve exactly, but they persevered. That they were resilient. And that, I'm sort of giving myself goosebumps here because that's just so empowering.
I can imagine that it is. When you are working with an individual that has had serious past trauma, is that to some degree reversible in most instances?
Yeah, some trauma is more difficult than others to treat, for sure.
I can imagine.
But I think that I think some of it is just sort of helping people to see that they have choice. That trauma doesn't have to define who they are.
That they have a choice of how they view that trauma.
That they have the choice of being able to move forward from that trauma. That it doesn't have to be them for the rest of their life. And that's sort of the beginning of the idea of hopefulness, the idea that things can change, and that you are stronger than you maybe recognize that you are.
And we're stronger in the midst of trial and adversity.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think that sometimes when you're in the midst of it, it's hard to have that perspective. So I think that having and talking to another person helps give you perspective on your experience, and I think that that's why sharing how your stories is really, really important, for sure.
Okay, I hadn't thought about it quite that way, but that's exactly what happens with the memoir group. I had a group here that stayed together for 8 years.
Wow.
Which is kind of amazing. Every other week meeting, so it was a lot of meetings. And we developed a rapport and a trust, and stories that really were, I think, it became probably the most meaningful experience in many folks' lives, that group. In addition, one of the things that I have said to you, a number of the in a number of the classes that I've had here, people have said to me afterward, I was so depressed when I started this group, and it just made all the difference.
Right.
It has always struck me the degree to which I'm hearing that comment.
Yeah, it is kind of amazing, but there's different forms of narrative. There's narrative therapy, which is the kind of more the heavy stuff, but there's reminiscence, which is really more about just kind of talking about your life story in a way that really does, as you said, it can address depression, it can give an improved sense of well-being.
Yes, it truly does.
And life review is another one that's a little bit of a different tweak on the whole theme, but it's more about finding sort of your kind of really identifying your purpose. Talking about meaning and purpose a little bit more intentionally.
Life review.
Yeah. So there's different ways of getting at it, but they all really do have a very a positive effect on people, for sure.
All right, there's a serious purpose then in our telling stories.
There is Absolutely, 100%. There's a serious purpose when that, 5-year-old comes home from school.
Okay.
And there's a serious purpose throughout our lives that when we're telling our story, hopefully there will be somebody there that will listen to us. That's the main thing.
All right. I think we think of storytelling as being, our mother's reading Hans Brinker to us, or something of that sort, or Grimm's fairy tales. But storytelling really does have a major function in our lives.
Yeah. And our personal narratives aren't that different from, any of the other stories that we read in books. They're all kind of common themes for sure. And I think that, the connection that it allows us to have with another person when we get past all of, the stuff and get down to the fact that we're all just people, really struggling in the same kind of way against, all different kinds of experiences, adversities, that we can relate to one another in a way that we sort of see that common ground, and that I think really, that connection that we make with another person is really so important, that we don't feel alone anymore.
No, this is a serious point. How does one react to stories that are just facts?
Well, I think if you listen carefully, maybe you can try to figure out. I think there's always a narrative voice. So, is the person proud? Then you say, something to sort of acknowledge that sense of, pride that they had accomplished what they had accomplished. I think that listening carefully, I think you can pretty much figure out what's important to that person when they're talking about it.
Yes. This is absolutely true.
Yeah.
Kathleen, is there any one preferred mode of telling our stories?
No, there's no rules.
Okay.
there can't be rules.
That's what I was waiting for you to say.
Rules, yeah. There is just, and it comes, I think it comes in all kinds of different ways. But like you said, your experience out in the community is that people are telling their stories all the time.
They are. Really, you can't go down the hallway without hearing stories.
Yeah. And my guess is there's some really good ones too.
Well, I always find it very interesting to hear snippets. I'm a collector of snippets, and because you have no idea, what the context is, but the snippets are just fascinating. So yes, I collect snippets, just the ones that are kind of off the wall.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, I'm thinking of the fact that in all of civilization, clearly oral tradition is the oldest. I mean, you can just imagine a Neanderthal child coming home saying, "Daddy, let me club a mouse today," kind of thing.
Yeah. This is really off the wall, but it's sort of interesting. While I was doing research on this, I found that they had some cultural anthropologist had done a study amongst different kinds of groups of people. And they asked them to identify how many storytellers they had in their group. And then they asked them, the same group of people, to take, I think it was like they were going to give them a certain percentage of rice. And then they were going to ask them to decide how much of the rice they were going to share with the rest of the group versus keep for themselves. And the groups that had more storytellers in their group gave more of their rice away.
So there was an altruism.
So there was a sense of connection to the rest of the group, a sense of togetherness that was more present when there were more storytellers, when people felt more connected to each other through stories, through personal stories.
Well, isn't that interesting?
I know, it's very interesting.
Well, I certainly think that one of the advantages in living in a place like Green Spring is the fact that we do have so many shared experiences, and there is so much sharing.
Right.
Of the shared narratives.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly right. And that brings a sense of closeness, of not
Yes,
feeling
yes.
alone. You know, of course, people put their own limits on themselves in terms of if they want to experience that. But the good news is that it's out there for people if they're willing to kind of reach out a little bit.
Kathleen, it doesn't even take much in the way of reaching out. I mean, I find if I stop and admire somebody's dog,
Then that's a conversation.
I'm probably going to start hearing stories.
Yeah.
Now, not about the dog, probably about the owner.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it really, people are very willing. I think people are very eager to share.
Yeah.
In
I
my
think so.
experience.
I think so. Too much time alone is never a good idea, because it does you do end up losing a little perspective,
Because you lose a lot of perspective. Yes.
Yes. Too much time in your own head, not good.
Yeah.
So having that interaction with other people really can help remind you of who you are.
Yes, and stories are.
And stories can do that.
A major part of that.
Yeah. It's time for us to wrap up,
I was
isn't
going
it?
to say, I see we're
my.
down to the last minute here.
Yeah. So that was pretty good, huh?
Oh, I think we're both finding this such an interesting notion, and I would hope that we can, in some ways, encourage some of this through things like memoir writing and other. We have had 2 legacy forums that certainly touched on this whole topic.
Yep.
So I would hope we could do it again in the future.
Absolutely.